What did kids do in the Middle Ages? When we imagine the Middle Ages, we often think of kings and knights, castles and cathedrals, wars and plagues. But what about the children? What was it like to grow up during a time when survival was uncertain, knowledge was rare, and childhood, as we know it today, didn't really exist? In the medieval world, children were everywhere, in villages, towns, castles, and monasteries. But they weren't always seen as we see children today. There was no concept of childhood as a protected, carefree stage of life. From the moment they could walk and talk, medieval children were expected to contribute, to learn, and to obey. Their lives were deeply shaped by the status of their families, whether noble, peasant, merchant, or clergy, and by the expectations of society, the church, and survival itself. Let's start at the beginning. The arrival of a child in the Middle Ages was often a mix of joy and anxiety. Birth was dangerous for both mother and baby. Many children didn't survive their first year. In fact, historians estimate that as many as 1 in 3 children died before the age of 5. Still, when a child was born, it was cause for celebration, especially if the child was a boy, due to inheritance, labor, and family lineage. Most births took place at home. The birthing room was prepared by female relatives and a midwife. Men were usually kept out. The baby would be quickly baptized, sometimes within hours, because death was always close, and baptism was believed to protect the soul. The church played a central role in a child's life from the very beginning. As infants, babies were wrapped tightly in swaddling cloths. People believed it helped their limbs grow straight and kept them safe. Breastfeeding was common, though noble families often hired wet nurses. Pacifiers didn't exist. Instead, they gave infants things like cloth, soaked in honey or wine. Toys were rare, but simple objects like wooden dolls, carved animals, and rattles could be found, mostly among wealthier families. By the age of 3 or 4, a child's life changed dramatically. For peasant children, this meant beginning to help with household chores or work in the fields. Little boys and girls might scare birds from crops, fetch water, gather firewood, or help take care of younger siblings. There was little time for idleness. Every pair of hands counted. The clothes they wore were simpler versions of adult garments. There were no colorful superhero outfits or princess dresses, just tunics, cloaks, and simple shoes if they were lucky. Most peasant children went barefoot. Bathing was rare. Dirt and lice were a part of life. In noble households, things looked different, at least on the surface. A noble boy might begin training for knighthood at the age of 7. This began with serving as a page in another noble house. He learned to ride, use a sword, serve at table, and most importantly, obey. Education focused on manners, religion, and discipline. Girls in noble families were raised to be good wives and mothers. They learned to sew, sing, dance, read prayers, and manage a household. Their marriages were often arranged when they were still very young, sometimes as early as 7, though the wedding itself would not take place until adolescence. Still, their futures were decided long before they had a say. For most medieval children, school was a distant dream. Education was reserved for boys in wealthier families or those destined for the church. Monasteries and cathedral schools offered Latin, scripture, and logic. Learning to read and write was not a right, it was a privilege. Girls were rarely taught to read except in convents. Many children, even among the nobility, remained illiterate. But learning happened outside of books too. Boys learned trades from their fathers. Girls learned domestic skills from their mothers. By the time a child was 10, they were expected to behave like small adults. There was little room for teenage rebellion in a world where survival depended on obedience and hard work. Apprenticeship was another common path. From the age of 10 to 14, boys might be sent to live with a master craftsman, a blacksmith, weaver, baker, or cobbler. They worked long hours, often without pay, in exchange for room, board, and the hope of one day becoming a journeyman. It was tough, but it offered a way out of poverty. And what about fun? Did medieval kids ever play? Yes, though their games were often simple, rough, and very different from modern play. Children played with sticks, stones, and handmade dolls. They had games like leapfrog, tag, wrestling, blind man's bluff, and hoop rolling. In towns, they raced through streets, made up songs, and played practical jokes. During festivals, they might watch traveling entertainers, jesters, or puppet shows. Winter brought snowball fights and sledding. Summer meant swimming in rivers and climbing trees. But playtime didn't last long. Most children were drawn quickly back into the rhythm of adult life, with work, duties, and expectations always looming. And when they misbehaved, punishment could be harsh. Beatings, shame, and isolation were common. The church taught that children were born with sin, and discipline was seen as a way to save their souls. Some parents were loving and protective, others were distant or even cruel. There was no standard and little understanding of childhood psychology. Still, love existed. Letters from medieval parents showed deep affection, hope, and sorrow when children were lost. Mothers mourned, fathers worried, children laughed, cried, and dreamed, just like today. Religion played a massive role in shaping a child's worldview. They learned prayers early, saints were their heroes, hell was a real threat. Superstitions were common, from avoiding the evil eye to believing in fairies and demons. A child's imagination was filled with angels and monsters, heaven and hell. As they grew older, the transition to adulthood came quickly. A boy might become a squire or apprentice. A girl might be married by 14 or sent to a convent. There was no concept of a teenage phase. Once you could work or marry, you were an adult. And yet, medieval children were not just small adults. They had their own experiences, fears, joys, and identities. They played, imagined, bonded with siblings, and formed friendships. They suffered, but they also dreamed. We often imagine the past as cold and cruel, and it could be. But even in the hardest times, children found ways to laugh, to learn, and to grow. Their lives remind us of the resilience of the human spirit, even in the face of hardship. So next time you think of knights and castles, take a moment to imagine the children running through the courtyards, feeding the animals, whispering secrets in the dark, or looking out at a starry sky, wondering what the world might hold for them. Because in the end, they were not so different from us. As the medieval child stepped further into the world, their environment continued to shape them in profound ways. For many, especially in the countryside, life revolved around the seasons. Spring was for planting, summer for growing, autumn for harvesting, and winter for surviving. Children quickly learned to read the land, to tell when the rain would come, when the crops were ready, and when animals would give birth. This kind of knowledge was passed down orally, not through books but through observation and repetition. A child who couldn't keep up risked being seen as a burden. The village community played a vital role in raising children. Neighbors kept an eye on one another. Older children looked after the younger ones, and gossip served as an informal system of discipline. A misbehaving child might not just face their parents' wrath, but the shame of public disapproval. Community was both protection and pressure. In towns and cities, children experienced a more crowded, bustling world. Street vendors, smells of bread and dung, the sound of bells and shouting traders. It was overwhelming and exciting. Urban children learned quickly how to navigate the noise, avoid danger, and sometimes beg, steal, or sell small goods to survive. Orphaned or abandoned children were sadly common, and many ended up as servants, thieves, or worse. But cities also offered opportunities. Merchant families might send their sons to learn trade, numbers, and languages. In some cases, girls were taught to keep accounts or run market stalls. Urban guilds could offer protection and training, and sometimes even education. A clever, lucky child might rise above their birth status, though it was rare. Clothing, food, and shelter varied greatly by class. A noble child might own garments of silk, linen, and fur, while a peasant child might wear the same rough wool tunic every day, patched and mended by their mother. Shoes were expensive. Many children never owned a pair. In winter, frostbite was common. Meals for noble children could include roast meat, white bread, cheese, fruit, and wine. For peasants, it was more likely pottage, a thick soup of grains, vegetables, and maybe a scrap of bacon. Bread, ale, onions, and eggs were common. Hunger was always a threat. During poor harvests, even the children felt the pangs of empty stomachs. Malnutrition and disease often followed. Illness was a constant shadow. Childhood diseases like measles, whooping cough, and dysentery could be deadly. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, and limited understanding of hygiene. Wealth could sometimes buy a doctor, but even the best medieval medicine was based more on superstition than science. Bleeding, herbs, charms, and prayers were the most common treatments. The church offered comfort and fear in equal measure. Children were taught about sin, judgment, and the fires of hell, but they also learned about saints who protected them, angels who watched over them, and a God who loved them. Religious festivals like Easter, Christmas, and Saints' Days offered moments of joy and celebration. Children might receive small gifts, join processions, or sing hymns. Religious dramas, called mystery plays, were popular in towns. These performances depicted Bible stories with costumes and special effects. Children watched wide-eyed as devils danced and angels descended. The stories left lasting impressions, shaping morality and imagination for life. One of the most profound aspects of medieval childhood was how early children were expected to take on adult roles. A girl of 12 might be married and running a household. A boy of 13 might be fighting in a war or managing a farm. Adulthood came not with age, but with responsibility. Despite this, many children found ways to hold on to moments of innocence. They told stories, sang songs, chased animals, built toys from scraps, and found wonder in the simplest things. A butterfly, a snowflake, a rainbow after rain. Love, laughter, and learning did not disappear just because life was hard. And what about the emotional world of these children? Historians used to believe that medieval parents didn't love their children, that high mortality made them distant and cold. But this view has changed. Letters, wills, and poems show deep love and grief. Parents celebrated births with feasts, mourned deaths with tears, and left heartfelt instructions in their wills about the care of their sons and daughters. In noble families, dynastic duty often outweighed personal desire. A girl might be sent far away to marry a stranger. A boy might be shipped off to fight or become a monk. But this didn't mean parents didn't care. Many kept portraits, sent letters, and worried constantly. Even among peasants, who left fewer written records, love was real. Folk tales, lullabies, and oral traditions speak of affection, warnings, hopes, and dreams passed from one generation to the next. Sometimes entire childhoods were interrupted by catastrophe. War, famine, plague, all were regular parts of the medieval world. During the Black Death, for example, millions died, and children were often left orphaned. Those who survived carried scars, not always on the body, but in the heart. Childhood trauma was real, even if it had no name. A child who saw their village burned, or their parent die, or was taken by a lord for service, grew up fast. And yet they endured. That resilience is part of the medieval legacy, a testament to the strength of children throughout history. And as the centuries turned, changes began to stir. By the late Middle Ages, new ideas about childhood started to emerge, especially among the educated. Books were written about how to raise children well. Schools began to spread. Some thinkers argued that children were not just small adults, but beings with their own nature, deserving of care and guidance. It would take centuries more for the modern concept of childhood to fully form, but the seeds were there, in a mother's lullaby, in a child's scribbled prayer, in the rules of a guildmaster who protected his apprentice like a son. So what did kids do in the Middle Ages? They worked, they learned, they played, they prayed, they endured. From noble courts to peasant fields, from bustling cities to quiet monasteries, medieval childhood was anything but simple. It was shaped by duty, faith, hardship, and the raw beauty of growing up in a world both brutal and wondrous. They were not just miniature adults. They were dreamers, survivors, and the beating heart of a medieval world that is often remembered only for its kings and wars. But behind every throne and battlefield was a child, watching, learning, and becoming part of history. If you've enjoyed this journey into the forgotten lives of medieval children, make sure to give this video a like, leave a comment to let us know what surprised you most, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the Middle Ages and beyond. Thanks for watching. And remember, history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about people, even the smallest ones.